Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Tonight, we're re-stepping into the lively and unpredictable world of medieval drinking culture, a world where ale and wine weren't just drinks, but the fuel of daily life, celebration, and sometimes disaster. Forget the polished taverns of fantasy films. Getting wasted in the Middle Ages was messy, loud, and often carried consequences far beyond a morning hangover. Alcohol was everywhere. In fact, it was often safer to drink than water, which was frequently contaminated. Peasants drank weak ale with nearly every meal, while the wealthy had access to stronger brews, imported wines, and sweet meads flavored with honey. Drinking wasn't simply about taste or relaxation, it was survival, ritual, and social glue. Picture the scene. Inside a smoky tavern, wooden mugs clink together as laughter bursts from tables packed with villagers, merchants, and travelers. The air smells of spilt beer, roasting meat, and damp straw trampled into the floor. By candlelight, dice roll, songs are shouted more than sung, and arguments teeter dangerously close to fist fights. Here, drunkenness was almost expected, sometimes tolerated, sometimes mocked, and occasionally punished. But the story of medieval intoxication wasn't limited to the tavern. Nobles hosted elaborate feasts where drinking became a test of endurance and pride. To refuse a cup could be seen as an insult. To outdrink your peers was a badge of honor. Chroniclers wrote of lords collapsing under the table, of knights who lost duels the next day because their hands still shook with drink, and of rulers whose drunken decisions shaped entire wars. Getting wasted was more than personal indulgence, it was woven into the rhythm of medieval life. It could bind people together in joy, or tear them apart in violence. And as we'll see, the Middle Ages had its own rules, dangers, and even punishments for those who took their drinking too far. If the castle was the seat of power, the tavern was the heart of everyday life. These smoky, cramped, and often noisy establishments weren't just places to drink, they were the social crossroads of medieval towns and villages. Inside, strangers became drinking partners, and neighbors became rivals over spilled ale or a crooked dice throw. News traveled faster through taverns than in royal courts. Merchants spread rumors of distant wars, wandering minstrels carried tales of love and betrayal, and locals whispered gossip about the baker's daughter or the miller's shady deals. In a world without newspapers, the tavern was the medieval newsroom, but the real attraction was, of course, the drinking. Ale flowed constantly, served in wooden mugs that were rarely washed properly. The floors were sticky with spilt beer, dogs lingered under tables for scraps, and the air was a mix of laughter, curses, and the occasional drunken song that swayed off-key with every verse. For the common folk, drunkenness was almost a kind of performance. Some saw it as comic relief, a way to laugh at a neighbor staggering into a pig trough or passing out face first on the table. Others saw it as shameful, especially when drinking led to brawls. Tavern fights were legendary, benches overturned, mugs used as weapons, and insults that escalated into bloody noses and black eyes. Local sheriffs sometimes looked the other way unless someone ended up dead, which wasn't rare. Yet despite the chaos, taverns were tolerated, even necessary. They were places of release in a hard world of endless work, poverty, and strict hierarchies. Here, a peasant could drink beside a craftsman, and both could forget, for a few hours, the weight of their daily struggles. Drunkenness was not just an accident, it was part of the spectacle. It gave the tavern its energy, its danger, and its unforgettable stories. And while priests might preach against the sins of ale, the people knew, without the tavern, life in the Middle Ages would have been a far bleaker affair. While taverns were the playgrounds of common folk, drunkenness was hardly absent from the halls of the wealthy. In fact, among nobles, feasting and drinking often became grand performances where power and pride were on full display. Medieval banquets could stretch for hours, sometimes days, and alcohol flowed without restraint. Wine was the drink of choice for kings and lords, imported at great cost from distant vineyards. Though strong ales and honey-sweet mead were also staples, drinking was not just about indulgence, it was a ritual of status. To raise your cup was to show wealth, toasting allies was a form of diplomacy, and to refuse a drink could be read as an insult. But excess carried its price. Chroniclers loved to note how nobles drank themselves into disgrace. Knights stumbled into duels the morning after a feast, still reeling from last night's wine, their hands unsteady and judgment clouded. Some lords made decisions in drunken stupors that shaped the fate of lands and armies. There are tales of rulers who signed rash treaties, promised dowries they could not afford, or declared wars over slurred insults traded at a banquet. Even kings were not immune. King Philip Augustus of France was said to have once fallen into a ditch after a night of heavy drinking. and chroniclers mocked him for it. Richard the Lionheart's escort was infamous for rowdy feasts where knights competed to outdrink one another, sometimes ending in humiliating collapse beneath the very tables they dined on. In these moments, the grandeur of crowns and coats of arms dissolved, replaced by the same red cheeks and slurred voices heard in every tavern. For nobles, getting wasted was both a symbol of power and a dangerous trap. It showed wealthy ability to drink endlessly from golden cups filled with imported wine, but it also revealed vulnerability. A king or knight who lost control of his cup could just as easily lose control of his crown or his sword. In the end, the difference between a peasant drunk in a tavern and a noble drunk in a hall was little more than the quality of the cup he drank from. For all the laughter, songs, and camaraderie, getting wasted in the Middle Ages was not without danger. Drunkenness carried real risks, both physical and moral, and society had ways of punishing those who let the ale get the better of them. The church, in particular, was relentless in its warnings. Priests thundered from pulpits about the sin of gluttony and drunkenness, reminding villagers that losing control of one's body was the work of the devil. To stagger in public was to expose not just personal weakness, but spiritual corruption. Monastic writings often portrayed the drunkard as pathetic, pitiful, and damned, a figure who traded dignity for a fleeting taste of ale or wine. But religious shame was not the only consequence. Secular authorities sometimes imposed punishments for public drunkenness, especially when it caused disorder. A drunk who brawled in a tavern might be thrown in the stocks, left on display for his neighbors to mock. Others could be fined or, in harsher cases, whipped. In some towns, repeat offenders were forced to wear humiliating signs or hats, marking them as drunkards, turning their shame into a public spectacle. The physical dangers were just as real. With weak sanitation and crude brewing methods, drinks could sometimes be contaminated, leading to illness or even death. Overindulgence could also be fatal in a more immediate sense. Chronicles tell of men who drank themselves into stupors only to freeze outside in the snow, or who drowned after falling headfirst into a barrel of ale. And then there was the violence. Drunken arguments could escalate quickly into fights, sometimes with knives or swords drawn. A night of heavy drinking could end in bloodshed, families torn apart, or feuds that lingered for generations. In a society where survival demanded discipline, the drunkard stood out as a figure of both ridicule and warning. He reminded everyone of the fine line between celebration and chaos, between fellowship and disaster. Not all medieval drinking happened in dim taverns or smoky halls. Some of the wildest scenes of intoxication unfolded during festivals, religious feasts, and community celebrations, where alcohol wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Harvest time was one of the biggest excuses for such revelry. After months of back-breaking labor in the fields, villagers gathered to celebrate the fruits of their work. Ale flowed freely, and new wine was tasted with both excitement and caution, since it was often stronger than expected. For one night at least, the poor could drink as much as the wealthy, and laughter echoed across barns and courtyards until the first light of dawn. Religious feasts also became excuses for indulgence. Yule, for example, the midwinter festival that blended pagan traditions with Christian observances, was a season when households brewed their strongest ale and slaughtered animals for communal feasts. Drinking together wasn't just merriment, it was ritual, a way to honor gods and saints, ancestors, and community ties. To refuse a cup was to risk insult, and to accept too many was to risk embarrassment, though both happened often enough. Weddings too were soaked in ale and wine. Guests were expected to toast the newlyweds repeatedly, each toast longer, louder, and less coherent than the last. By the end of the night, it wasn't unusual for half the guests to collapse onto benches or floors, while others tried, with varying success, to sing Bodhi songs until morning. Even saints' feast days, meant to inspire solemnity, often turned into excuses for riotous drinking. Priests complained in sermons about congregants stumbling drunk from churchyards, yet year after year the pattern repeated: devotion in daylight, indulgence by nightfall. In these moments, drunkenness became more than just personal folly. It was communal, woven into the rhythm of medieval life, a way of affirming survival, kinship, and the fragile joys of existence in a harsh world. Drinking culture in the Middle Ages wasn't the same everywhere. Each region left its own mark on the way people celebrated, endured, and often lost themselves to alcohol. In the Norse lands, the great mead halls stood as legendary centers of feasting and fellowship. Mead, brewed from honey, water, and herbs, was more than a drink. It was poetry in liquid form, celebrated in sagas and myths. Warriors and poets alike raised their horns in honor of the gods, swearing oaths and boasting of deeds, their words growing bolder with every swallow. These gatherings were not just drunken revelry, they were sacred, binding men together in loyalty, honor, and sometimes blood. Farther south, in the heart of monasteries, a different kind of drinking culture flourished. Monks perfected the art of brewing beer, turning it into both a craft and a source of sustenance. For many monastic communities, beer wasn't considered indulgence but nourishment, especially during long fasts. Brewed thick and rich, it was often called liquid bread, and it sustained both monks and lay people alike. Ironically, those who preached moderation were also some of the best brewers of the Middle Ages. In France and Italy, wine reigned supreme. Vineyards stretched across hillsides, and noble families grew wealthy from their harvests. Wine became a marker of sophistication and status, though peasants drank it too, often watered down. The culture of the cup varied by class. The nobility sipped it from elegant goblets, while the common folk gulped it from rough earthenware, yet the intoxication felt the same. Meanwhile, in Germany and the Low Countries, strong ales and beers became staples of everyday life. Towns competed for reputation with their brews, and festivals were inseparable from overflowing mugs. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was civic pride, an emblem of identity that bound communities together. Across Europe, alcohol shaped both the grand and the ordinary moments of life. From Viking oaths sworn in smoky mead halls, to monks quietly perfecting recipes in stone-walled breweries. Whether holy or profane, refined or rustic, the cup was always present, linking survival to celebration, the sacred to the chaotic. For all the laughter and fellowship that drinking inspired, medieval society also bore witness to its darker, lingering toll. Chronic overindulgence left marks that no feast or festival could hide, and the figure of the eternal drunkard became a cautionary presence in both stories and daily life. Physically, the effects were harsh. Medieval medicine already linked excessive drinking with swollen bellies, trembling hands, and failing minds. Chroniclers described men who could no longer work their fields or wield their swords because drink had consumed their strength. Others developed what they called dropsy of the stomach, a bloating that today we recognize as symptoms of liver failure. In a time when life expectancy was already short, those who drank too much often cut their own years even shorter. Socially, the drunkard was often shamed. He was the butt of jokes in taverns, the man children mocked as he staggered down the road, and the subject of sermons warning against vice. In art and literature, he appeared as a grotesque figure, hunched over a cup, unable to rise above his basest instincts. To be remembered as a drunkard was to lose honor, reputation, and dignity, a fate nearly as feared as poverty itself. And yet, despite the warnings, drunkenness was tolerated, even expected in certain settings. It was a paradox. One could be mocked for drinking too much, but also mocked for refusing to drink at all. The line between merriment and disgrace was razor-thin, and once crossed, the consequences could echo for years. Families suffered when a husband drank away wages, when quarrels fueled by ale turned violent, or when a lord's drinking left estates in disarray. To many, the eternal drunkard symbolized the fragility of human will, the way a cup could enslave as surely as chains. He was both a warning and a mirror, reflecting back the dangers hidden beneath the comfort of ale and wine. Alcohol in the Middle Ages was more than a drink. It was a paradox, standing at the crossroads of the sacred and the sinful. To many, it was a blessing, a gift from God or the gods, capable of warming the body, easing pain, and turning hunger into feasting. But to others, it was temptation made liquid, a test of discipline that could drag the soul into ruin. In churches, wine carried divine weight. It was consecrated in the Eucharist, transformed in the eyes of the faithful into the very blood of Christ. To share the cup was to share in salvation, and for peasants who rarely tasted fine wine outside of Mass, it was a moment of transcendence. In that sense, alcohol wasn't tea merely tolerated by religion. It was embedded at the heart of its holiest ritual. Yet the same drink that symbolized salvation could also symbolize sin. Priests thundered against the dangers of overindulgence, equating drunkenness with gluttony and lust. Confessionals echoed with guilty admissions of tavern nights gone too far, of brawls and betrayals fueled by ale. To lose oneself in the cup was to open the door to the devil, who, preachers warned, waited at the bottom of every mug. Even outside the church, alcohol carried symbolic weight. Mead in the north was a drink of oaths used to seal alliances and marriages. To break an oath sworn over the drinking horn was to defy both community and the divine. Beer brewed in monasteries was considered liquid bread, sustenance for body and soul, yet its strength reminded monks that even holy hands could craft temptation. Thus, the medieval world lived in tension with the cup, both needing it for survival and fearing it for its power. A single drink could be communion, too many could be damnation. In this duality, alcohol became a mirror of human nature itself, capable of nourishment, joy, and fellowship, yet equally capable of destruction, folly, and shame. Not all drunkenness in the Middle Ages was confined to nameless peasants collapsing in taverns. Some of the most memorable stories of intoxication involved kings, nobles, and knights whose cups tipped the scales of history itself. When the powerful drank too much, their folly became legend. Take, for instance, the infamous drunken antics of Edward II of England. Chroniclers describe feasts where the king and his companions drank so heavily that decisions of state were delayed, alliances forgotten, and rivalries inflamed. His reputation for weakness and indulgence was only worsened by these nights of excess, giving enemies yet another reason to undermine his authority. A ruler who staggered instead of stood firm became an easy target in the eyes of ambitious nobles. Then there were knights whose drinking shaped not only their reputations, but their fates on the battlefield. Some stories tell of warriors who, too drunk to stand straight, nevertheless insisted on riding into combat. Predictably, their bravery collapsed as quickly as their balance, turning them into tragic or comic figures remembered more for their cups than their swords. In one tale, a knight missed his duel entirely, because he had passed out from drinking the night before. His absence was marked not as bad luck but as shame. But perhaps the most striking cases were when entire courts drowned themselves in wine. The Byzantine Empire, already infamous for intrigue, saw banquets where politics dissolved into drunken shouting matches. Alliances sealed with a cup of wine in the evening could unravel with a hangover in the morning. Chroniclers relished these contradictions. How statesmen who spoke of honor and faith by day slurred insults across goblets by night. Even more dramatic were the instances when drunkenness ended in tragedy. In France, Charles VIII's death in 1498 was directly from wine, but from carelessness after attending a game. Yet contemporaries still linked the king's courtly lifestyle of indulgence with the fragility of his sudden end, and countless local lords, whose names are lost to history, met their downfall at banquets, either from poisoned cups slipped into their hands or from reckless words spoken in drunken bravado that sparked feuds lasting generations. Of course, not every tale was tragic. Some drunken episodes became comic folklore, retold in villages for centuries. There are records of mayors who fell asleep drunk in pig troughs, abbots who had to be carried from feasts by their monks, and traveling performers who spun their drunken stumbles into slapstick acts for tavern audiences. In these lighter moments, drink was not destruction but theater, an exaggeration of humanity's foolish side, to be laughed at rather than condemned. What unites all these tales, whether of kings, knights, or peasants, is the way alcohol blurred the line between greatness and folly. One cup too many could topple a reputation, derail a plan, or even rewrite a kingdom's fate. And while modern readers may laugh at these medieval mishaps, the lesson lingers. In an age when survival was already precarious, the cup of ale or wine was both comfort and curse, capable of binding communities together or unraveling them entirely. From smoky taverns to gilded banquet halls, from monks perfecting beer in stone-walled monasteries to peasants collapsing in harvest barns, alcohol was a constant companion in the medieval world. It brought people together, fueling laughter, songs, and fleeting escapes from hardship, but it also tore lives apart, leaving scars of violence, shame, and tragedy that echoed far beyond the last sip. From smoky taverns to gilded banquet halls, from monks perfecting beer in stone-walled monasteries to peasants collapsing in harvest barns, alcohol was a constant companion in the medieval world. It brought people together, fueling laughter, songs, and fleeting escapes from hardship, but it also tore lives apart, leaving scars of violence, shame, and tragedy that echoed far beyond the last sip. The cup was a paradox, sacred in the chalice of the mass, yet sinful in the trembling hands of the eternal drunkard. It could nourish, heal, and bind communities, or corrupt, weaken, and destroy. In this way, medieval drinking culture was less about alcohol itself and more about the eternal human struggle with desire, discipline, and the search for meaning in a fragile world. We like to think of the Middle Ages as distant and foreign, yet their cups were filled with the same contradictions we know today: joy and regret, freedom and restraint, celebration and ruin. The stories may be centuries old, but the truth remains timeless. So perhaps the real question is this: When we lift our own glasses, are we any different from those who lived and drank 1,000 years ago? Or are we still in our own way chasing the same fire at the bottom of the cup? The cup was a paradox, sacred in the chalice of the Mass, yet sinful in the trembling hands of the eternal drunkard. It could nourish, heal, and bind communities, or corrupt, weaken, and destroy. In this way, medieval drinking culture was less about alcohol itself and more about the eternal human struggle with desire, discipline, and the search for meaning in a fragile world. We like to think of the Middle Ages as distant and foreign, yet their cups were filled with the same contradictions we know today: joy and regret, freedom and restraint, celebration and ruin. The stories may be centuries old, but the truth remains timeless. So perhaps the real question is this: when we lift our own glasses, are we any different from those who lived and drank 1,000 years ago? Or are we still in our own way chasing the same fire at the bottom of the cup?